There should be some mystery about the opposite sex when you're young, especially. And another reason I was always very skeptical of those programs is because the way they treated abstinence education. They said you're teaching religion if you tell kids to be abstinent, which is so bizarre because it's not like only religious parents don't want their kids to make that mistake and do something like that outside of marriage. My dad actually in the late 80s, early 90s, he wrote an abstinence-only sex education guide that was used in a number of schools. And the ACLU funded a lawyer to sue them to get the curriculums out of the schools because they said it was teaching religion, even though there was no mention of God, there was no mention of religion. And so what my dad would do is he would give conferences to educators about this, and he would ask the entire room of people, how many people in this room believe that the high schoolers at your school should be having sex? No one would raise their hand. How many think they shouldn't? They would all raise their hands. If we all believe they shouldn't, then why can't we tell them not to? And so it becomes clear that the whole agenda behind these programs was to normalize it, to spread the state's values about this kind of behavior instead of the parents' values.
Well, and I get why that popped up because and that was a kind of, the other side saying, well, wait, you've been teaching about other sexes and other forms of sex, let's put it that way. And now we want to say the other one, which is not having sex. And you guys aren't talking about that. And so that's where that came from, just to be clear, because, you got to remember back. This was after years of being, having sex ed, and then getting to the point where, oh no, you were being judged if you didn't let your kid have that sex ed talk.
Just to play devil's advocate a little bit here, if the child is not having sex, or if the argument is to not have sex, then that's kind of where the sex education ends. Right, like if it's like, oh yeah, we should be telling kids to abstain, then there isn't anything further that you would be telling
but
kids
this
in schools at least.
This is an important point, though. The purpose of sex education on all levels is actually to tell kids what not to do. Because when someone gets married, they'll figure it out. But what sex education programs now do is they still tell you, don't have sex without this form of artificial contraceptive, right? It's still done in a way where you're telling people what the limits are and what not to do. Abstinence-only sex ed just says, don't have sex outside of marriage, which we know is the most conducive to human flourishing. You're less likely to get divorced if you don't have sex outside of marriage. You're less likely to get STDs. You're less likely to have a child outside of wedlock. It's not even just for religious reasons. By all measurable life outcomes, it's better advice, but we don't give it to kids.
Well, and I think a big problem is they just say, well, but if you get pregnant, don't worry. You can just get rid of it. That's right. Another problem is and it's in me.
That is what came from that idea.
Right. And so I think the idea was, and even me growing up, it's like, well, if you have sex, you get pregnant, you're going to die. It was one of those things that don't get pregnant. And, you're so scared. You're like, well, I can't take care of a kid. That scared you into not doing it because you're like, I can't. I'm 17, I'm 16, whatever. I can't take care of a child.
Nowadays, women young women go to, the gynecologist for their first checkup, and the first thing they would do is try and put them onto birth control. Right away. Yeah. So, that actually if you're on birth control, that does take away that concern of I might get pregnant,
In reality TV.
Well, sure. But listen, no, I understand that. But the point, the general kind of feeling that people have is I can't because I'm on, right? It's not about whether or not it'll fail. It's just that, and so they behave as if they cannot.
Well, and even then
I think you're right.
They see abortion as I don't know, I hate saying it this way, but they see it as like a get out of jail free card. They're like, I can just go abort the kid. And then when you dare to say, well, we should defund those clinics, or we shouldn't support this, then you're the bad guy for wanting people to have kids and start families and maybe not kill the baby. That's it's insane. It's absolutely insane.
Well, I don't know if you know, but we're just having way too many kids in America.
Apparently.
It's a really big problem is we're way above the replacement rate.
Right, yeah.
People their families are too large now, so we have to be very concerned.
Pull back to entertainment. So most of what I've seen.
Let's talk about cartoons, please.
Sorry.
Pull back to entertainment, and all of that is valid. But the point is most of what I've seen in television and in movies is that they would treat the idea of like teenagers having sex as inevitable, therefore tell the reality of the story, right? Like you were saying earlier, there's like, if we tell the kids in the show about teenagers to just not have sex and none of them have sex, then the story's kind of over and there's nothing to tell. And that's the Trojan horse they use to make that. Very rarely do they end up going into the story about the character that does have to have an abortion. When they do, they're not going to show it as the painful experience that it is. And that has been done in the past. Like in my generation of like TV shows about teenagers growing up, there was usually those episodes, but those are the ones that tended to feel like they got out of entertainment and went into edutainment, and you felt like you were being preached to. So it wasn't even done in a tactful manner that was able to communicate, just how painful and awful something like abortion is in a way that didn't feel like you were being preached to by whoever's making it at the time. And the thing that I always say is like, well-told stories makes the propaganda go down easier. And it would be nice if they could actually do that with something you want to show, like the horrors of abortion. Whereas most of the time when they were telling those stories, you ended up turning it off or going to something else because you're like, I get it, it's bad. Whereas the other stuff, the propaganda that's to tell you all of the generically modern liberal talking points were made really, really well at that time period. So you end up kind of imbuing with those ideas without realizing it because it was made so well. But the stuff that you needed to actually convey well wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, it's a slippery slope that we've been on. And that's the point, which is, I grew up in a poor area. And I must admit, I'm a little bit on the biological sex in the schools talk. And that's where it started, I think, was a good thing. I think being in a poor area, I didn't have a dad growing up. I didn't know about any of that stuff. My mom wasn't telling me, and she certainly didn't know probably a few of the guy versions of the story. I don't know. She did have kids, so maybe she did. But like, certainly I kind of needed that talk, I'll be honest. And all my friends didn't have dads. Like, none of us did. There's a huge lack of dads in this poor area that I live in.
Sorry to hear that. That's rough.
It was rough. Yeah. I mean, I took we had they used to do these things too. I'm on a tangent, but they used to do these things at schools where you'd have father-daughter night and they'd come and have a dinner and I don't know, do something fun.
So we did something in second grade. It's actually a very wholesome story.
Yeah.
I'm sure my dad will end up watching this, but there was a kid whose dad hadn't been around, and I grew up in a, nice suburban area, and there was a kid whose dad didn't show up for second grade. It was like a fathers come in and have breakfast with the kids, and my dad just was like, "Come here. You're ours now." And I haven't talked to this kid in probably a decade or so, but I can still remember that story. It had such an impact on me. My dad was like, "Your dad's not around? Okay, cool. Well, now you have
come
me."
with us.
Like, and it ended up being my brother was friends with his brother, and it all kind of worked out really well. I think your point of like, there's no one to have that conversation sometimes, that's why parents can opt out. If a parent's like, I want to have that conversation with my kid, you can opt out.
Yeah.
And that's fair. And for some kids, it's necessary because they don't have a father or mother around.
I honestly needed that talk. And
Right.
I can honestly say that from being a kid that didn't know anything about that.
Right.
And yeah, it was yucky and icky and embarrassing. But I mean, and I know, later on I got a pretty good education about women because I had 4 daughters. But and I was that guy going to get tampons at the grocery store for many years. But I will say, we've started as a society, I think, with really good intentions, honestly. And the schools had very good intentions. But those good intentions have gone so far to build. But this person now feels like an outcast, or this person feels left out. This person feels out. That we now have gone so far. Like, why couldn't we just had a counselor that certain group that didn't feel like they were represented in the bigger group? They could go talk to that person. I don't know. There's probably just other ways around it. And I think but now we don't have the father-daughter night. Yeah. We don't have some of the good stuff that we had. And I was going to say my version of that was like my mom brought me to father-son night. There was a father-son night, and my mom brought me. And there were a lot of moms there that night representing the dad. And it was embarrassing a little bit and stuff like that. But you also, I love my mom.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
She was amazing. She filled that gap.
Sounds like it.
And I didn't feel like I missed out too
Incredible.
much.
And did she raise you Christian or did you convert later?
We were raised actually Catholic at the very beginning, but we always had faith. But she did drop away. She had a lot of troubles with the church, and a lot of it had to do with being left behind and alcoholic father that I had.
I'm sorry to hear it.
Yeah, no, it was hard for her, and so she struggled with her faith for sure. But she always felt like it was important for us to be exposed to it, honestly, and that would be the way she would probably put it. And so we found faith just going to church in a fairly irregular, but then later on more regular as she kind of came back to the church. So yeah, I would say yes, we were brought up Christian.
Wow. Well, I guess to sort of segue back to what we were talking about, I want to mention one more interesting and haunting stat I learned about media consumption. In households where television is watched more often, teenage pregnancy rates are higher, which is jarring to know that that's actually been quantified and that we do know that certainly, but I don't know that anyone's shocked by that based on the kinds of things we see on television. We know the kind of media people consume does influence their behavior. I was speaking, I want to say about 2 years ago on a podcast with Dr. George Barna, and he did a study on this specifically about where children get their values. And what he found is that what children saw in media had much more of an effect than what they heard at church or what their parents taught them or what they heard in school. So it's so important for people with good values to be making media. And that's sort of why I want to segue back to what you were talking about with your studio. If you want to talk a little bit, A, about going to Big Idea Studios, and B, then starting your own venture and beginning to make your own films.
Yeah, well, immediately when I went to Big Idea and I started working on VeggieTales, and it had been going for a while. It was kind of at it during its heyday. The very first video I did was Esther. I learned computer animation, which was hard enough to do that big switch from 2D animation to hand-drawn 2D to now I'm using a mouse and animating. It was so hard.
That must have been really hard.
Fortunately, they didn't have arms and legs. It was a good way to start into CG animation. It was like, kind of pretty basic. But, learning that, but then at the same time, now I'm going to meetings where we pray in the beginning of the meeting. I had left Disney where even back in the late 90s and now 2000, when I left, I would get talked to by HR if I was talking about what I learned in church, with a friend, and somebody else overheard it and felt awkward, and so they report it.
Reported you to the commissar.
They would do it very gently back then. You weren't going to get fired, anything crazy, but you were just going to be like, hey, can you keep that in your office? Somebody felt awkward, hearing that. And so, but the shock was still very evident when I went to they didn't call themselves a Christian company because legally they weren't they were a for-profit and blah, blah, blah. But most of the people there were Christians. And so they would say you have to agree that if you're going to work here, that you're okay with Christianity. Basically, it was the way they put it, because we are going to pray in beginning of meetings and things like that. And so it was such an eye-opener, and I was already a believer and a Christian. That's the whole reason I was there. But to see this new culture where you could bring it to work. I could be 100% me.
That's awesome.
At work. And I never felt that way. And it wasn't until I left it that I even realized I was missing the other part of me. And now I'm actually feeding it into the content too. I'm actually talking about things I learned in the Bible that we can maybe put in here into the content. And so that was just such a game changer for me and an eye opener, and then doing it with humor and all that, and finding new ways to tell these stories that I think people were really responding to back in those days too. That led me to then, after they went bankrupt and things like that, I started my own company, but then we helped create the Superbook show for CBN, and that went for like good 5 or 6 seasons, and I was with them for many years just as a contractor, but basically helping them create and develop, and I even directed the pilot episode of Superbook. Then to, many other little smaller children's books and things like that I was involved in, and finally starting my own company, Pencilish Animation Studios, and that was in 2020, right as everybody was going into COVID, and I'd heard about this Reg CF, so I did a crowd invested company, so I got about $3 million from about almost 5,000 people, and started Pencilish. And we create edifying content. It's not all Christian content. I want to just make that clear because I have investors that are not believers, but they knew me. And they knew, so some people think, oh, it's all going to be Christian content because they knew I was a believer. And I'm on Instagram and I have a good following and stuff like that. So I had a lot of people that were coming in that just knew who I was already. But most of them just loved 2D animation too. And they knew I stood for that. That was something I was going to try and keep going. And so they all were kind of coming for different reasons. Oh, he's a former Disney guy. He's going to create new IPs that, I smell money. And, he might make the next Mickey Mouse and I can own a piece of that. Yeah. That would be pretty cool.
There is a desire for the return of 2D animation anyways. I know Disney was already talking about trying to, like, they wanted to resurrect 2D animation at Disney. Like, crap, we don't have anybody who can actually do it anymore.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.